Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to our first theology night, hosted here at South Hill Baptist, but we're, of course, Table of Hope. Just a few things to orient us to our location. I want to first thank South Hill Baptist, of which there are no representatives here to hear me thanking them, but when they see it on the recording, hopefully they'll hear our heart and our sincere thanks for letting us use their venue. In case you don't know, bathrooms are around out that door and down the hall on the left. Don't eat in the sanctuary, please. We have some bottles of water for your convenience, but if you want to have a snack or something, maybe step outside for a minute and eat during the break. Table of Hope, all of you know us, but those of you recording or watching the recording may not know. We're Table of Hope. We're a small community church here in Puyallup, South Hill. We meet at the Fruitland Grange Sundays at 10 a.m., and our mission at Table of Hope is to use our tables to share His gospel, Christ's gospel. And this coming Sunday, what is the date this Sunday? 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th? 25th. So this Sunday, the 25th, for anybody that doesn't know quite what Table of Hope is all about, Pastor Tyler will be bringing a message in which he talks about the mission and vision and values at Table of Hope. So that'll be a great opportunity to attend and to learn a little bit more about Table of Hope. And as I mentioned a minute ago, this is our first theology night. This is something that we hope to do on a fairly regular basis, maybe once a quarter, something like that. But it gives us an opportunity to go a little bit deeper into various theological topics than we have the opportunity to do in the Sunday morning services. So anybody that's got a itching to dig a little bit deeper into the Bible and to various theological topics, this is going to be an opportunity to do that. And anything under the sun we might discuss over the course of our various theology nights. Our agenda for today is going to go until up to 8:30 p.m., we've got roughly 50 minutes of presentation, and then we'll take a quick 5 to 10 minute bio break, and then we will have some group discussion for as little or as long as we want until 8:30 at the latest. And here's what the agenda is going to look like as far as the presentations and stuff. First, I'm going to give a brief introduction, or brief as I can make it, on the book of Revelation and why it is that we're doing a theology night on the book of Revelation. And then we're going to go through the four Christian historical views of the book of Revelation. Many viewers will only be familiar with the first of them, the futurist view. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to hear from another presenter to present the historicist view, the idealist view, and then finally the preterist view. And then we'll take a quick break and discuss. And each one of the four views will be presented by a different presenter, so you get a little bit of variety in speaking style and slide style and all that kind of stuff. And part of the goal is to help develop people that might be interested in speaking and teaching, either at Table of Hope or wherever they might go for church in the future. So I'm really appreciative for those people, those of you who are here going to be speaking, and I'll introduce you when it's your turn. So let's talk a little bit about the book of Revelation for a few minutes before we turn things over to our first presenter. The reason why we wanted to do a theology night on the book of Revelation is because many, many people are very intimidated by the book of Revelation, so much so that they resist digging into the book and reading it and trying to make any sense of it. And there's at least two reasons why the book of Revelation tends to intimidate people. One of them, and I just looked this up, I just did a quick Google search this morning and found a blogger by the name of Aaron Davis, who writing about the book of Revelation says that up until recently, the book of Revelation caused two very specific reactions in my heart. The first was terror. There's some scary sounding stuff in there. I guess a part of me worried that if I really read it, it might actually happen, as if not reading it is going to prevent it from happening, but you see the point. And to give you an idea of just how much this does tend to instill fear in people, consider some of the popular movies, or not so popular movies in the case of Left Behind, but movies in popular culture and Christian culture that trade on concepts and themes and figures that feature in the book of Revelation. Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, End of Days with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Left Behind with Kirk Cameron, and tons and tons and tons of others. They're all over the place in movies and TV. You're going to hear a little bit about some other examples from one of our speakers. All these and plenty of others feature concepts and figures and themes from the book of Revelation, and they're horror movies, with the exception of Left Behind. So it's something that in popular culture tends to instill some fear. It's also something that Christians sometimes panic about because of world events. I remember very shortly after I became a Christian, about 20 years ago, I discovered that every single barcode has the numbers 6 and 6 and 6. Every single barcode. And I was like, oh my gosh, what if that's the mark of the beast? Now, I don't think that anymore, but that was something I was concerned about. Here in the left-hand corner is a picture of an RF chip that people are sometimes getting implanted into their hands for cashless transactions and various other things. And the book of Revelation talks about the mark of the beast on people's right hands. And so a lot of Christians are freaking out that chips in the foreheads and hands is the mark of the beast. Very recently, plenty of Christians around the country thought that the COVID-19 vaccines were the mark of the beast. And the mark of the beast is something that features in the book of Revelation. So this is something that not only inundates popular culture to instill fear, but is also something about which Christians exhibit a lot of fear. The other way or cause for intimidation with the book of Revelation is just its difficulty, the difficulty of making sense of it. So the same woman I was quoting from earlier says, the second reaction felt more like an airplane whizzing right over my head. I just assumed that I wasn't smart enough or spiritual enough to understand whatever it was that God was trying to say in this cryptic book. And so perhaps those of you watching online or some of you that are here, you might think that these popular memes nowadays kind of capture your emotions when you consider trying to make sense of the book of Revelation. It's tough. It's difficult to make sense of. It's notoriously difficult to make sense of. And so so there are at least two causes of intimidation: fear and just worry I'm not going to be able to make sense of it. And yet, that very book tells us that blessed is he who reads this book and those who hear the words of the prophecy and heed the things that are written in it. So even though we experience fear, even though we experience worry that we're not going to be able to make sense of it, the book itself calls us to read it and to be blessed by reading it. And that's why as Table of Hope, we wanted to get together and do a theology night on the book of Revelation and present some varieties of interpretations, some of which you won't be familiar with, and some principles for interpreting the book of Revelation in each of those major views, so that perhaps you will be encouraged to give it another shot and maybe have a few more tools at your disposal than you might have thought you had before. Now, as for the book of Revelation itself, the name of the book is Revelation, singular, not plural. That's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. It's okay if you're somebody that has been in the habit of pronouncing it the book of Revelations. Please don't do that in my presence. The name of the book is because of the very first sentence in the book, the revelation of Jesus. The word is apocalypsis. It's where we get the word apocalypse, and it means a revealing, taking something that's hidden and opening it up for people, which is a little ironic given how difficult it is for some to make sense of the book sometimes. It was written by somebody who identifies as John. A lot of scholars do think it's the same John who wrote the Gospel of John and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd letters of John, but it may not be. It's not absolutely clear, and it could just be some otherwise unknown John that has the gift of prophecy, and we just don't know. The book identifies as a letter. In theology, we use the word epistle to refer to one of these kinds of letters. It's a letter that is written by John to 7 churches in what we know today as Turkey. It's also known as Anatolia or Asia Minor. In ancient Rome, it was a province of Rome known as Asia. So here's a map of the Mediterranean world. There are a lot of countries there that you'll recognize the names of: Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, Jerusalem, or Israel, Turkey, etc. And what we're going to be zooming in on is this area right here, the west coast, the west end of the peninsula, the Turkey Asia Minor Peninsula. So we'll zoom in there. And in the book, that John begins it by saying, I'm John writing to the 7 churches in Asia, and I was on an island called Patmos. Patmos is that little dot in the bottom left-hand corner there of the map, so a little island off the coast. And then he writes to 7 churches that are named in chapters 2 and 3. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, which means brotherly love, by the way, and Laodicea. So this is what we're going to be exploring today, is a letter that John wrote from that island to 7 churches on the west coast of Asia Minor. It was written in either the mid-90s AD, that's sort of the more popular understanding of when John wrote the book of Revelation, or the mid-60s AD, and that's something that will come up as we discuss the competing views of the book. Another way to think of this is it was written either shortly before or not terribly long after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. The destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD by the Romans is one of the most well-attested events in ancient history. Lots and lots of evidence from all sorts of varieties of fields. And to give you an idea of when 70 AD was, the Colosseum was built beginning in 72 AD, and then again, and was completed in 80 AD. So when you think of, if you have a chance to look at some pictures of the Colosseum and think about how old that is, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the book of Revelation. I mean, the siege of Jerusalem, and Revelation was written either shortly before or after it. And finally, it records or purports to record a seer is like a prophet, prophetic vision. And this is really important because there's difference of opinion on what visions are like in Scripture, what prophetic visions are like. So John records, for example, that from the smoke that he sees came locusts like horses prepared for battle. Crowns of gold they wore. They had faces that were like human faces. They had breastplates of iron, and they had tails and stingers like scorpions. So you can picture that what John is probably seeing is something not altogether different from that picture right there, which is some kind of bizarre symbol of some other real-life thing that it's symbolizing. That's how some of the views of Revelation understand the nature of the vision that John is recording. But some interpreters think that John is actually seeing the future, but it's so unfamiliar to him that it's difficult to describe what he's seeing. So there are some interpreters of the book of Revelation who think that these locusts with the tails of scorpions are John's attempt to describe military helicopters, which of course nobody had ever seen 2,000 years ago, and so there wasn't language that made it capable of describing those things. So that's one of the questions you have to explore as you're interpreting the book of Revelation is he seeing symbols? Is he seeing the future literally? Is it some combination of the two? And there are, broadly speaking, 4 views of the book of Revelation, 4 schools of interpretation. And I'd encourage you to check out a couple of resources if you want to learn more about each of these views. One of the resources I would recommend is by a friend of mine named Steve Gregg with 2 G's. Gregg, and it's a Revelation 4 Views parallel commentary. The picture here on the screen is of the updated version. I've got an older version here on the front table. But it's really fantastic because throughout the whole book of Revelation, all 4 interpretations are laid out side by side so that you can see and compare how the different interpretations understand the book. Another book I would recommend is by Zondervan in their Counterpoint series. It's edited by a guy named C. Marvin Pate, and it's called 4 Views on the Book of Revelation. Now, interestingly, it only represents 3 of the 4 views you're going to hear from today, but 2 versions of one of those views. So if you get your hands on these books, that would be an opportunity to explore these views in greater detail than you'll have the opportunity to do today. But let me really quickly walk through the 4 views and then turn things over to them to go more deeply into them. The view that most of us are going to be familiar with is known as futurism, so called because it's believed to mostly predict events in our future. And this is the view that almost every convert to Christianity is going to start out with because it's just so popular. It's almost the default. Then there's what's known as historicism, which is so called because it thinks that the events predicted by the book are fulfilled throughout church history, from shortly after the time it was written, periodically all throughout church history. And we'll hear more about that in a little bit. A third view, which is, and both historicism and idealism vary at times in how popular they are. Historicism has in the past been much more popular than it is today. Idealism now is probably becoming more popular than it has been in the past. I could be wrong about that. But it's called idealism because the book on this view isn't actually predicting future events at all. It's more describing cosmic themes of good and evil, God versus Satan, victory over sin, and so forth, that recur all throughout church history. And then finally, there's a view known as preterism. The word, you'll hear more about this when we get to this view, but the word preterism comes from a word that means past, and it's the antithesis to futurism. So whereas futurism says that the book mostly predicts events in our future, preterism says the book mostly predicts events that were fulfilled in our past. Now, this is sometimes called partial preterism today because, according to this view, preterism, only some of the book of Revelation was fulfilled in our past. There still remains a little bit to be fulfilled in our future. So some people call it partial preterism as opposed to full preterism. Now, if you want to, in case of visualization helps you think about this a little bit more, here's a diagram where from left to right is time, beginning with the line on the left, which is representing the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. There's a vertical line on the right representing right now, and then the arrow continues into the future. So what futurism says is that a little bit of the book of Revelation was fulfilled in our past. Most notably, the opening chapters of Revelation were fulfilled in the distant past. And the reason why there's a half-transparent red there or brown color there is because a futurist might say the book was written after 70 AD. Some would say it was written before. And so those events in the near future that predicted could have actually extended back before 70 AD. But notice the thickest, most prominent part of the arrow is after now. And that's because it's the view that most of Revelation is yet to be fulfilled in our future. And the reason why there's a transparent brown or red line over there is because some futurists believe that things are already starting to get fulfilled. Many of them will point to the recreation of the nation of Israel, for example, as a fulfillment of some prophecy. Right now, there are apparently cows being shipped to Israel to Jerusalem for sacrifices or something, and some Christians think that that's actually we're watching things start to unfold before our very eyes. But nevertheless, most of the book predicts things that have yet to be fulfilled according to this view. Historicism sees the book being fulfilled throughout history. And so I've represented it with sort of these little blocks of fulfilled time, just representing that at any point in history there might be some part of Revelation that's being fulfilled. Then there's idealism, which doesn't really concern itself much with fulfilled prophecy at all. Like I said, it's cosmic themes, God versus Satan, good versus evil, all throughout time. So it's really different from the other three in that it's not about the future events at all, from now or in the past. And then finally, preterism, like I said, is the antithesis of futurism. So most of Revelation, according to us preterists, think that it was fulfilled around 70 AD, and that at some point in our future, the end of the book of Revelation will start to be fulfilled as well. So maybe this visualization will help you, maybe not, but we'll hear from each speaker, and they'll tell you a little bit more about each view, beginning with our friend Katie Wolf, who will tell us about the futurist view. Come on up.
Hi, guys. My name's Katie. Thank you for that, Chris. I love that graph. I think it's my favorite thing about this whole presentation, actually. So I'm going to be talking to you guys about futurism today and hopefully help you develop your understanding of it a little bit more. But I think you guys will find what I found in that I already had a pretty good idea of what futurism was. I just didn't have the language to explain it. So the end is near, right? The idea of futurism is that the majority of the book of Revelation is going to happen in the future. There are some people, like Chris said, who believe it has already started, that we're already seeing the prophecy be fulfilled, that it's already happening, right? And we see signs like this with like evangelical Christians on a street corner trying to convert people passing by, right? Because they believe that the end time is here and they need to convert you to save your soul, right? But in general, futurists don't necessarily believe that the end is here or the end is even near, but just that it's coming. It'll happen eventually, and, you know, they don't subscribe to a necessary date or time that it's going to happen. The reason why futurists kind of believe what they do, the basis of the fact that it's going to happen in the future, is because of Revelation 1:19 that says, "Write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later." And because of this, not only do futurists believe that the bulk of Revelation takes place in the future, but they believe that it's generally broken into three distinct parts. So, what is seen is John's vision, which is what's described in Revelation 1. It's him just kind of introducing what's happening and the revelation of Jesus, right? Like Chris talked about. What is now is the letters to the 7 churches, which are described in chapters 2 and 3. That's talking about just the general things that's happening in those churches, right? And really addressing them personally. And then what we see happening later is everything from Revelation 4 on. So it's the literal rapture, it's the Antichrist and the beast, and Christ's millennial reign. And you'll notice that I mentioned specifically that there's a literal rapture. And while not every futurist takes a literal view of what's happening in Revelation, just a general rule of thumb is that they do take a pretty literal view. So it's a really approachable way to read Revelation, because you don't have to think about all the, spiritual things, or that you're not smart enough to understand it, because you can just take it at face value and believe that what you're reading is what's coming. So, with that being said, the literal way that futurists kind of see or read these big events of like the 5th trumpet, which is in Revelation 9, it's talking about how, the 5th angel sounds their trumpet and a star falls from the sky and an abyss opens up, and out of the abyss is wafts of black smoke that, cover the sun, cover the sky, and that's out of that smoke is where the locusts come, the locusts that Chris were talking about that have, the power of scorpions with faces of a horse or bodies of a horse, faces of a human, teeth like a lion, all of these really dramatic, crazy looking things. Who knows? I can't even imagine it. I don't want to. But those locusts, I guess, are only going to harm those who don't have the seal of God on their head, right? So futurists believe that is literally what is going to happen. There's no, military helicopters, it is very literal that this is what you should expect to happen. You don't have to you don't have to write a whole long thesis about the symbolism of this, because you don't have to. You can really take it at face value. The second part is the 2 beasts, right? We hear about the mark of the beast. We hear about the 7-headed 10-horned dragon or beast. We hear about the dragon. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in Revelation 13. It's crazy. But in general, it's really easy to just read it and take it at face value, like I said. So futurists believe that there will be an apocalyptic time where great beasts rule the planet. The dragon, that's called Satan, the devil, the Antichrist, a bunch of different names throughout this chapter, will call upon the beast of the sea. That's the 7 heads, 10 horns. Super fun, really love it, terrifying. And the beast from the earth, which has 2 horns, looks like a lamb. All of that, or 2 horns like a lamb. And at the end of this chapter, it's where we hear about the mark of the beast, right? We hear about 666 all the time. It's the mark of the devil. If you see that written somewhere, you don't go there. Scary place, right? But people who are futurists genuinely believe that the mark of the devil, 666, will be written on the people who worship the beasts, who worship the dragon, and that when we get to the millennial reign, those people will not be resurrected. They will not get to live with Christ during his 1,000-year reign. So, what's going to happen, futurists believe, is that Satan is going to be locked away, the dragon's going to be locked away in the abyss for 1,000 years, and God will resurrect his people, the people who have the seal of God on their forehead, and they will live in harmony for 1,000 years. And futurists believe that those who testify about Jesus through those times of the beast reigning will get to live in glory and live with God and, all of that really great stuff that we all really want, right? So, super exciting. Where we see futurism show up in pop culture, because, these seem like really grand ideas that we see reflected a lot right? We saw it in Left Behind. While we didn't really get to the beast, the millennial reign, we saw the beginning, right? Where God's people are called up and they are left. Like, everyone else is left behind on earth. People who did not subscribe to God, people who did not people who didn't live the life, really, and everyone else was left behind. They were stuck on earth trying to figure out what's going on. It was the literal rapture. And, you should see the movie. It's not a high production movie, but it's really great. 10 out of 10. Very entertaining. But, that kind of shows us the early chapters of Revelation, where people are called from earth to heaven, and everyone else is left behind. And then Supernatural, over the course of, I think, the 13, 14 seasons that exist, we see a lot of commentary around God and the devil and the interactions between them. And it's a very loose interpretation of Revelation, but it still draws heavily on the Bible, because they are talking about, there's angels, there's demons, there's God, there's Satan, there's all of the biblical things in the show. But yeah, so that's the basics for futurism. Super easy, super simple to understand. Take it at face value. You don't have to think about it too hard. You can just read the book and take it as it is. It's terrifying. And yeah, so that's it for me. Michael, if you want to share about historicism now, that would be great, because I don't know anything about it.
So I'm going to present the historicist view of Revelation. And the name kind of says it all. It's for history buffs and people that like history. And funny enough, the person who popularized this view, at least like 1100 AD onwards, I actually thought that it was the obvious view of Revelation, the clear view of Revelation, that if you just read Revelation, that's what you would get. So he put it in a commentary. The commentary spread everywhere, and that's how the view was popularized. So yeah, historicism, we have all of history in mind. It covers the whole scope of history, and I'm going to be mainly discussing the meat, Revelation, after John's letters to the churches, the whole meat, the whole drama that we kind of associate with the book of Revelation. So historicism has all of history and the future as its scope while interpreting the book of Revelation. So yeah, it has all of history, then it has all of the future, technically, because, not most historians don't believe everything is fulfilled. If they did believe everything was fulfilled, they would be something else, not traditional historical historicists. Historicism sees Revelation as creating a timeline. I think this is actually one of the biggest and most important things to understand, is if you see all of Revelation as pretty much a timeline, like from almost kind of like start to finish in that meat area of Revelation, then you're going to trend towards the historicist view. If you want a nice timeline, like as if you're reading a history book, but a very biblical, crazy, symbolic history book, then that's historicism. So the thing about, historicism is that the content it draws from history is massive, and it's important. If you're going to decide, okay, I like this historical view, then you also kind of want to know a lot about history. And so also, since there's so much from it, you can kind of skew the timelines of history and how you fit them into the book of Revelation. And you get wide-ranging timelines that start and end. They emphasize different sections of history. Another important thing to learn when you're talking about history is written by the victors, or at least history is, in a sense, in one way, written by the dominant cultural view of it. And so how you perceive history will actually be different, like based off of your opinion, what you find important about history. And so when you're trying to fit history into the book of Revelation, you have to understand, well, what I find important about history might be different than others. For example, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and Protestants see history differently. They see church history differently. What's important about history? You know, some, obviously, Protestants see the Roman Catholic Church very differently than Roman Catholics. So we're going to go into the examples of kind of like how historicism might interpret something. For example, the two beasts. The vast majority of historicists see the two beasts representing the Roman Catholic Church, whether the interpreter is Roman Catholic themselves or Protestant. It's kind of widely agreed that the two beasts kind of represent the Roman Catholic Church in some way. Roman Catholics see the two beasts as kind of like trials in their church, or bad popes, or bad times, or pagan times in their church, where these two beasts are inflicting their church with terrors and trials. Protestants see the two beasts in the Roman Catholic Church too, but they see it in a much more negative, lasting sense, lasting unto the Reformation. In fact, this is a really important part of the Reformation is Luther and Calvin generally started to equate views of the Antichrist or the beast with the Roman Catholic Church. And this is actually kind of from the historical viewpoint. They wanted to see a timeline. They saw the Roman Catholic Church in that timeline, in that historical timeline of the church. So this kind of highlights one of my points I brought up earlier, is that how you see history, whether you see, like, for example, the Roman Catholic Church in a positive or negative light, will influence how you see history, and therefore how you would interpret the symbols in the book of Revelation as they apply to history. Another example is the fifth trumpet. Katie covered that one pretty well. The weird locusts. Historicists kind of have different views of this, but I'd say the thing that really convinced me, and I'd say seemingly a lot of scholars like it, is to see the fifth trumpet as, and the locusts as like the spread of Islam for a big period of time, maybe 150 years, which correlates to the 5 months where each day is a year. And in this view, obviously, in this view of history, they're mainly seeing the symbols correlate to physical invaders and political shapings of the world. So you're interpreting the symbols more in a political, physical sense. Another view I saw was Martin Luther and the Reformation, where the locusts were seen as Martin Luther and the Reformers. I know, very insulting to us Protestants, but, I guess it goes both ways. But, locusts are seen as, in more of a religious sense, in a more of ideological sense, attacking the Roman Catholic Church. And so, as you can see already, there is different ways to view the symbols in a more political sense or a more ecclesiological sense, in a sense regarding the church itself. So, the period in history between these interpretations is 800 years. So that's like, as you can see, when you get 2,000 years of history, you get wide-ranging timelines. And the second important thing is, notice how the Roman Catholics, who have a very high church view of the church, they have a high ecclesiology, they center a lot of how they perceive the world around the church. And this happens to Lutherans and Anglicans too, and sometimes Presbyterians, and so on. But certainly Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox have a high view of the church. And so this very, very much colors how they interpret the symbols. And what's the most important things about history to the Roman Catholic? The popes, the ecumenical councils, for example. These things are very important to them, and Eastern Orthodox. So let's go over the pros and cons of historicism as I see it. This is just my opinion. But like when you're getting into a lens, hey, there's some good things and some bad things, And we're here to learn, and we're here to kind of grow and choose. So the pros. History has already happened. The future hasn't, So there's some kind of verifiable historical things you can actually look into. You're not guessing the future or trying to find the future. You're looking at what already has happened. And we have history, we have the study of history, we got scholars, we got things that we know history from. There's some verifiability to trying to look at these patterns. And another pro and a con is history is vast. So you got a lot of content to make really nice, neat things kind of fit into Revelation. And so, it's better to have good content and good fits to your symbols than trying to look in the future or trying to look just like right now and trying to fit something that has happened in the past 10 years. That's a way less content, and you might have a less fitting, it might be harder to fit something when you only have a span of 20 years rather than a span of 2,000 years. Now, the criticism of historicism is history is written by the victor or through the lens of meaning, and so views of history differ, the importance of historical events differ, and what this goes to, which is my kind of thought, is that the Bible may be a better lens of meaning than your own view of the meaning of historical events. So maybe it's more important to know what God means by history, and since we really don't know, it's hard to know what God sees as important 1,000 years ago. It really is really hard. And so maybe the Bible is maybe where I should try to draw my meaning of history from rather than my own kind of views. And so if you're trying to look for history and its meaning, just be careful to not draw your own meaning into the history and then apply that through the lens of historicism to the book of Revelation. That might be a danger. And history is vast. That's also a criticism because it's hard to, not everyone's a history buff. And so therefore, if you're really going to go deep into historicism, you have to at least have a view that, God expects you to know a lot of history. Or at least God expects those who interpret the book of Revelation to learn a lot of history. And depending on how you see that, that's going to affect of how you think, okay, does God mean for me to learn 2,000 years of history? Now, I like history. I like learning history. I believe it glorifies God. But does God expect that? That's a kind of question to ask as well. All right. And that's it. And now we're moving on to the idealist view.
I'm just going to be really frank with y'all. Chris and Katie and Michael are much smarter than I am, so hedge your expectations. Oh, that's cool. Why do y'all read the Bible? Like, not like, why should you read the Bible? Because, like, I can give you guys the Sunday school answer that, like, I'm supposed to and it makes me a good person. But, like, realistically, like, why do you guys read the Bible? We're dating? Oh, it's entertaining. Yes. Like, I mean, I can see Stars looking at me right now, and she's like, man, I asked Daniel to come up and do a presentation on idealism, and he's grilling me right now on why I read the Bible. But there's a point to this. I mean, when I read the Bible, I really sit down because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to be really candid about it. I don't know what I'm doing. And the Bible is filled with stories of people like David, who found a woman really sexy and wanted to sleep with her, so he murdered a guy to do it. And, you've got Saul, who was committing genocide against an entire religious belief. And those men went on to become a man after God's own heart, or write the majority of the books in the New Testament. And it really gives me a lot of hope that someone like me who doesn't know what he's doing can figure things out and make things happen. And then you touch the book of Revelation. And as a guy who doesn't know what he's doing, it's even more confusing. There's a beast and locusts, and there's these trumpets and seals, and then 1,000-year reign. Like, I thought that Queen Elizabeth was around for a while, but 1,000-year reign. Whew, okay, that one didn't work. Idealism is really unique, and it can help approach things that seem really scary. The first time I read Revelation, I was convinced that John just ate some bad mushrooms and wrote a book about it. And I decided to throw it to the side and move on because, man, it's a weird book, in case that hasn't been emphasized enough during these presentations. But then I came across this idea of idealism. Idealism says these really big images, because that's what Revelation is. That's what most prophecies in the Bible are. We can see it all the way back to Joseph and his coat of colors. Prophecy biblically is primarily imagery. And idealism purports instead that the imagery is symbolic. These prophecies that we're seeing are not literal. We're not going to have locusts invade or wormwood fall into our seas. Instead, we're looking at ideas such as absolute evil, such as things like greed and wealth, and whether or not you want to decide if that symbolizes an economic structure or not. People read Revelation with idealism, and instead of saying, wow, there's this really scary monster, maybe instead that monster are people doing evil things in the world. That's why I really recommend trying out reading Revelation through an idealist approach. I mean, instead of having to sit down and go, we're all going to disappear and then a monster is going to attack all of our non-believing family members, that's pretty horrible. And I wouldn't judge you for not wanting to experience that idea yourself. Try sitting down and looking at Revelation instead through the idea of imagery. What do these things represent? What is John trying to communicate to us through his own way, through symbols, as God has communicated through many people with? When God gave Joseph visions, he was not giving him visions of actual wheat fields, but rather he was representing the economic struggles that Egypt was going to go through. And I mean, why you read the Bible is, personally, if you're like me, you don't really know what to do. There's so many times in my life I have just sat down and opened up my Bible because I didn't know what to do, and I needed God to tell me. If you look at it through an imagery perspective, there's a lot that can be gleaned from Revelation. Revelation isn't just a story about the apocalypse and evil triumphing. The end is beautiful. And sometimes reading Revelation through an idealist approach says, hey, everything's going to be okay. And maybe Revelation is a book of the Bible that says that in the end, God wins. And that can be really broadly applied. There's a lot of other views that look at it as, oh, this is something that's going to happen in the future, or, oh, this is talking about things that happened in our past. And if I'm being completely candid, those things aren't relevant to me. I really struggle when I read Revelation like, man, that sucks for those people that are going to be left behind, but why do I care? Or, man, that sucks that happened to those people 800 years ago, but why do I care? When you read Revelation with an idealist approach, you are forced to take those concepts and ideas and apply them to you, and apply them to your life. And it's why I would challenge everyone to at least give Revelation one go. It's only 30 pages, guys. Applying Revelation is something that looks like this. You've got this beast, right? Look at that guy. You see him in a dark alley at night, you're running the other way. And so it can often be really hard to get over that hurdle of, wow, I don't think that something like that looks real. That looks like something out of a movie, something out of a TV show, right? And with how good special effects are nowadays, when you read the book of Revelation, it often comes across as something like a movie or a TV show. I might read Lord of the Rings and I might read the book of Revelation and have a hard time telling the difference. If you're someone like that, maybe approach Revelation through the idea of absolute evil, right? We can all relate to some monster coming into our lives. And that monster might not be something with 5 heads and 10 horns, that monster might have been domestic violence, or someone being greedy and taking something from us, or, a homelessness, poverty. These are absolute themes that we've seen all throughout history. People are stricken by poverty today around the world, and that monster of poverty is something that can be very real to them, and they can empathize with and understand, these struggles of class. What's really important when you dive into these issues is you make sure not to modernize it. There's always going to be some hot button issue that everyone's talking about, whether it's, hey, racism is really a problem, or, hey, we need to look at LGBTQ rights. And it's really important not to grab whatever the big issue in headlines is right now and look at Revelation and go, oh, the beast definitely symbolizes the oppression of the LGBTQ community, because that narrows God's word. We're restricting the applications of something that's so much broader than that. And so you want to make sure that you're not just looking at things from a modern perspective, but you're keeping in mind, this is a book that was written 2,000 years ago, guys. And it applied to them today, and it applies to us now, and it's going to apply to people 1,000 years from now and 10,000 years from now. So we want to be really careful when we're applying these things, not to just look at it from a modern perspective. When you read Revelation with an idealist approach, it really comes across as a book of hope. And that's one of the biggest things that I like to emphasize to people is they get scared by the doom and gloom of Revelation. When you read it from an idealist approach, it preaches hope. And I think it mirrors really well the rest of the Bible. Because I've struggled with Revelation of, wow, it's hard for me to believe a God that is going to call David a man after his own heart, or Saul, who is out there committing murders, and he's going to make him one of the last apostles. But God, that same God, is going to do all these horrible things. When you instead look at it through an idealist approach, it perfectly mirrors stories just like Esther. It talks about how good will triumph over evil, and that Christ's reign is absolute. An idealist approach doesn't think that Christ's reign is something that's going to happen in some future that we will never get to be a part of. An idealist approach says that Christ reigns today, he reigned 1,000 years ago, and he's going to be reigning 10,000 years from now and throughout eternity. It's really exciting because we can see the 1,000-year reign happen throughout history. We can see Israel being reformed, a representation that ultimately God gave that promised land back to his people, and that God did not fear that. Overall, I really recommend giving a book of Revelation a try. And I'm going to let someone who knows a lot more about what they're talking about share a little bit more, because Chris knows what he's doing.
All right, last but hopefully not least is the view that I will be presenting to you all. It's called the preterist view, or preterism, and we'll talk about that in a moment. That art, you saw it earlier, that's an old painting of a depiction of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans in 70 AD. And you'll see, as I dig into this view, that that is a very prominent aspect of this view. So the word preterism is so called because the word preterite means past. Some old textbooks, if I'm not mistaken, will sometimes refer to the preterite tense, meaning the past tense. And preterism, in a nutshell, is the view that the book of Revelation was written around 65 AD, give or take, and it primarily predicts events surrounding the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD by the Romans. But it also, toward the end of Revelation, predicts a very long passage of time after which Christ will return to raise the dead and a few other things. And one thing that's important to understand is that when I say the book predicts those events in the preterist view, it does so by means of that kind of perplexing symbolism that Daniel talked about when he was talking about idealism. So almost everything in the book of Revelation in the preterist view, like the idealist view, is a symbol, much like symbols you see in prophetic visions all throughout Scripture. Daniel mentioned Joseph in prison with his multicolored coat. Actually, he lost his coat before he went to prison. But when he was in prison, you guys might recall that he interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. And those dreams, those visions, featured branches with grapes budding on them and baskets of bread on top of somebody's head. But when Joseph interprets those visions for people, what he says is that those branches are 3 days. after which you, Mr. Cupbearer, will be restored to office. And then he tells the baker, the baskets on your head are 3 days, and after that you will be removed from jail and executed. So, and it's like this all throughout Scripture, according to a preterist. All Scripture, all prophetic visions of the future foretell the future by means of symbols. Now that makes it a little difficult to interpret, but it's an important distinction. Now, why do preterists think that the bulk of Revelation was fulfilled in the past? Well, because John seems, to preterists anyway, to go to a great deal of, he goes to a great extent to make clear that the bulk of the book of Revelation was soon to take place. He does that at both ends of the book. So in the very first couple of verses, John says this is the revelation of Jesus Christ of things that must soon take place. And he says the time is near. And then all the way at the other end of Scripture in chapter 22, he repeats, these are the things that Christ showed his servants must soon take place. And the book records Jesus saying, I am coming soon. The time is near. I am coming soon. Surely I am coming soon. It's like John is hammering it into the reader's head that most of what you've just read about, if you're talking about the end of the book, and most of what you're about to read about, if you're still at the beginning of the book, is right around the corner. In fact, that word near means at hand, like the distance from your elbow to your fingertips. It's within reach. And so the preterist thinks it's strange to say either it doesn't predict future events at all, when John seems to go to great length to tell you he is, or that the things he's predicting are in the extreme distant future, like 2,000 years from now, because that would hardly be described as soon or near or at hand. But there's some other reasons why preterists take this view. That's not Daniel 12:4. That's supposed to be Revelation, sorry. But there's a passage in Revelation where the 7 heads of the beast that John sees, that terrifying beast that you saw Daniel put up, is interpreted. So an angel tells John what the heads of the beast represent. And what the angel tells John is the 7 heads of the beast are 7 kings. 5 of whom have fallen or died, 1 who is right now, and then a 7th yet to come. So this gives preterists the impression that John is being told this beast symbolizes a succession of kings, a succession of rulers, 5 of which have already come and gone, a 6th is presently ruling. And sure enough, with some finagling, you can look at the line of Roman emperors, the word for which would have been king, the reign of Roman emperors, beginning with Caesar, and then Augustus, and then Tiberius, and then Caligula, and then Claudius. That's 5. And who's reigning at around 65 AD? Nero. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to that in a second. And then there's some open questions about who the 7th one is going to be. So the preterist sees this and thinks, well, gosh, it sure sounds like John is saying this thing represents a succession of kings, the 6th of which we are seeing presently reign right now in John's day. But, as I said, preterists don't believe that all of the book of Revelation has been fulfilled. We believe most of it has. But then in the Revelation chapter 20 chapters after the beginning of the book, so most of the book of Revelation on a preterist view has already happened. But then, chapter 20 introduces this period of time called 1,000 years. Revelation 22:3 says, Christ seized the dragon, Satan, bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the pit until the 1,000 years were ended. And then a little bit later, John says, when the 1,000 years are ended, then I saw a great white throne, death and Hades give up the dead who were in them. That sounds like resurrection. And he talks about the lake of fire or hell. So this 1,000 years, this number 1,000, whenever it's used as that round number in Scripture, just means a really big number. So, for example, you might remember a passage in the Old Testament which says that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Well, have you ever asked yourself who owns the cattle on the 1,001st hill? Well, obviously God. Right? The point is not that 1,000 means 1,000; it's that it means a whole lot. And so in John's vision, he sees 1,000 years transpire after 20 chapters of things that would soon happen, and then this great long period of time begins, and then there's some things at the end. So the preterist says, well, I see right here baked into the vision a distinction between most of the book of Revelation, which happened in our past, and then a little bit at the end that is awaiting fulfillment in our future. One important distinction about preterism is that when Jesus says in the book of Revelation that I am coming soon, we preterists don't think that he's talking about his return, his second advent, that when he will come back after having ascended to heaven. Rather, we think that this is stock prophetic language of coming in judgment, of God coming in judgment on people. So for example, in Isaiah 19:1 and 16, Isaiah says the Lord is riding on a swift cloud. Coming on the clouds is language that Jesus uses in Matthew 24. And comes to Egypt. In that day, the Egyptians will tremble with fear before the hand that the Lord of hosts shakes over them. Now, nobody thinks that God is going to sort of saddle up on a cloud and ride down to Egypt from heaven. It's symbolism, just like Revelation, and the coming language is the language of coming in judgment. So the preterist thinks that the coming of Jesus in 70 AD was a divine coming in judgment upon first century apostate Judaism because they rejected their Messiah. So in a nutshell, the message of Revelation, according to a preterist like me, is that God wanted to encourage John's readers who were being oppressed and persecuted, sent to their deaths, thrown to the lions. Emperor Nero is reported to have captured Christians and then wrapped them in tar-covered garments and hung them from lampposts and set them on fire to light the way to the games. So Christians were under a great deal of persecution in John's day, and according to the preterist, well, John's day, if it was written in 65 AD. And the preterist says that God wanted to encourage John's readers that that time of persecution and oppression by both the Jewish and Roman authorities would soon come to an end. And then the gospel would go out unfettered, freely, into the whole Gentile world. Gentiles are non-Jews. And then eventually, many years later, 1,000 years in the vision, but 2,000 or maybe even more years, Christ will then return to raise the dead. So that's the message of Revelation in a nutshell, according to a preterist. Now let me apply it to two texts in Revelation so you can see kind of how this works in the preterist thinking. So the seven-headed beast that we've seen pictures of and have talked about a lot, an angel tells John, or rather I think this is John writing himself, he says, "This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man." And the number is 666, not 666, which means, by the way, that barcode thing I showed you that I was so wrapped up in 20 years ago is total bunk. Because that's just 3 sixes separated by a bunch of numbers. That's not the number of the beast. The number of the beast is 666. Actually, in some manuscripts, it's 616, and we'll get to that in a minute. Well, so what a preterist observes is that in the time of John, there was a practice of something kind of like numerology that was very popular amongst the Jewish people. In fact, it's still popular amongst the more mystical of Jewish people, even to this day. The practice was known as gematria. Here are 3 examples of books that you could go and buy right now off of Amazon or eBay or whatever that all come at this practice of gematria from a Jewish perspective. And the way gematria worked is that every letter in a given language had a corresponding number. And you could calculate the number of a man. All you got to do is take the letters in their name, their numbers that correspond to their letters, add them up, and the resulting sum is the number of that man. Widespread practiced in John's day. And by the way, it enabled people to talk about people in sort of a subversive way that goes below the radar. So the preterist thinks that John is doing that. He doesn't want to come out right and say who this person is, because then that person is going to come down on him hard with the Roman authorities. So he's subversive. He gives hints, clues, so that it flies below the radar, and the reader is expected to do this work himself or herself. So the preterist thinks that John's Jewish readers would have recognized this number of a man language as gematria, and they would have summed up the numbers corresponding to the letters in a name to try and figure out who this is a cryptic reference to. Well, remember what I said a moment ago. Some manuscripts, in the various copies that we have of the book of Revelation, the number isn't 666, it's 616. Now that's interesting, because if you take the Hebrew letters that were used to refer to spell out the name of Nero Caesar, this one on the top, reading from right to left, is Neron Kaiser, right? Neron is Nero, Kaiser is Caesar. And if you add up the numbers, all Jews recognize these were the numbers that corresponded to those letters. And if you add them up, you get 666. But here's what's interesting. If you use the Latin way of pronouncing Neron Caesar, which is Nero Caesar, well, now that letter N at the end of Neron isn't there, so you remove 50 points from the sum, and what do you have? 616, which just happens to be what some manuscripts of Revelation say. So the preterist says, well, gosh, we can speculate till the cows come home about what 666 might be in the future, a barcode, a chip implanted in your hand, or whatever. But we've got historical records that show that this is how Gematria would have come up with Nero Caesar's name, the emperor who was ruling at the time that John is writing in 65 AD, according to preterists. He also just happens to fit the description of a nasty, terrifying beast because, again, he would hang Christians up and light them on fire to death to light the way to the games and all sorts of other stuff too. So according to preterists, most of us anyway, the seven-headed beast represents Rome, with the sixth head of the beast representing the Roman emperor that was alive and reigning when John wrote his letter. The second example we'll apply preterism to is the 1,000 years. You've heard people today describe it as the 1,000-year reign, and that's because what John sees in this symbolic vision is that martyrs rise up and rule with Christ for 1,000 years, and then at the end of the 1,000 years, there's the resurrection of the rest of the dead and so forth. Now, one of the things the preterist observes is that the text tells us why in John's vision Satan is bound at the beginning of that 1,000 years. It says Christ bound Satan for 1,000 years so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. Now, most of us don't know this, but in the Jewish mind, the nations just is the Gentiles. It's just the Gentile world, the non-Jewish world. So the preterist thinks that after God judged Jerusalem by destroying the temple, the gospel was much more freely spread throughout the non-Jewish world because they no longer had the Jewish authorities persecuting the Christians. And by the way, the Roman persecution of the Christians began to start to ease up as well. Now, it would take another couple hundred years until the time of Constantine, at which point Christianity was made the national religion of Rome. But the point is that the oppression brought about by this terrible wedding between the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities, that oppressive power came to an end with the destruction of Jerusalem, and it freed the gospel to go out into the Gentile world. And what have we seen since 70 AD? The gospel of Christ has indeed taken over a whole ton of the world and is still making inroads into parts of the world that it has yet to make inroads into. So that's what we preterists see, or think we see anyway. But then, at the end of the 1,000 years in John's vision, he sees that Satan will be released. And we could talk about what that might mean. Perhaps, if the reason he was bound was so that he would be able to no longer prevent the gospel from going out into the non-Jewish world, maybe his release will mean that the non-Jewish world will start rejecting Christ more and more, and perhaps the Jewish people will embrace him. That's one preterist interpretation of what's going on here. But either way, after the 1,000 years and Satan is released, then Satan and the beast and the false prophet are thrown into a lake of fire, and then he sees a great white throne, and then death and Hades. Hades is the underworld, the place where the dead are. They give up the dead who were in them. Well, that sounds like resurrection. So a preterist reads this and thinks the bodily resurrection of the dead, which Christ talked about and Paul talked about, will happen after the 1,000 years are over, and that 1,000 years represents the period of time we're in right now. It began with the destruction, or roughly at the destruction of Jerusalem, and it will continue until Christ returns. Because again, Christ doesn't own the cattle on 1,000 hills. He owns it on the 1,001st too. So 1,000 years is just a very large number, meaning a very long period of time. So some things to take away. Why should you consider preterism? Well, number one, I contend, rightly or wrongly, that only preterism takes the so-called time statement seriously at the beginning and at the end of Revelation. Futurism and historicism both say that there's a whole crud load of the book of Revelation that was not in any way, shape, or form fulfilled soon or near. And idealism says there's no specific events at all, if I'm not mistaken. So preterism, though, says, look, John bookends the book with, these are going to happen soon, the time is near. And we're like, yeah, that makes sense. Also, it shows, if it's true, then it shows the Bible to contain accurate predictions of the future. Right? You can point to events that seem to be the fulfillment of these symbols in Revelation and be like, wow, the Bible accurately predicted that, which suggests that it's not merely a human book. Also, on this view, the book has plenty of relevance to first century readers, which would be the ones that John was writing to. Now, idealism has that as well, because it's relevant to anybody in every generation. But to some extent, futurism and historicism would not be very relevant to John's original readers if that's in fact the right interpretation of the book. So preterism says most of the book of Revelation actually had direct relevance to John's original audience. But that doesn't mean it's altogether irrelevant to us, because as Daniel did a great job of explaining, there's also this beautiful picture of hope at the end of the vision, including our own resurrection from the dead. Death isn't the end of the story for those of us who are in Christ. We will one day rise and be made immortal and live forever. And finally, one of the most beautiful things about preterism is that we don't have to panic about current events. When we see chips that people are implanting in their hands, we can explore whether we want to do the same thing because of its benefits. We don't have to worry it's the mark of the beast, because that was 2,000 years ago. We don't have to look at the COVID vaccine and be like, gosh, I don't want to risk getting the mark of the beast, or whatever. We don't have to do newspaper exegesis of the book of Revelation and try and compare everything in Revelation to what's happening in the newspaper in the odd event that maybe it's starting to be fulfilled. So it's a peaceful way of reading the book as well. And I want to leave you with a few resources in case you want to explore this view more. On the left here is a book that was influential for me almost 20 years ago by an author who has now passed away named R.C. Sproul. The title of the book is The Last Days According to Jesus. And he talks about the book of Revelation, but also Matthew chapter 24, which is a big, long prediction on Jesus' part as well. And he talks about how preterism tries to make sense of those books and those passages. The book in the middle is by a scholar named Kenneth Gentry, and it's called Before Jerusalem Fell. Now, this will be interesting to you if you're a history buff, but the reason why it's useful is because remember what I said at the very beginning when I was introducing this theology night. I said there's a debate between those who think the book was written in the 90s and those who think it was written in the 60s. Well, this book is a preterist case from history, from archaeology, from literature, etc., that the book was in fact written in the 60s and not the 90s. So if you're interested in the date debate, and I don't mean the Chris date debate, I mean the date of the Book of Revelation debate, that's a good book to get. And then finally, if you're somebody that likes Left Behind, and by the way, I liked the Left Behind series. When I became a Christian, I dove into those. Do you remember me, Star, when I would read those books? I liked them. They were fun read. Now, I think they're bogus now, but the point is, the Apocalypse Code by a guy named Hank Hanegraaff is like Left Behind in that it's a fictionalization of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, but from a preterist perspective. So what you'll get to read about in the Apocalypse Code and in its... Oh, wait, actually, you know what? I put the wrong book up there, I think. There's another book that I'd forgotten the name of, and I'll try to remember it and get back to you guys. That is what I'm talking about, a fictionalization. This one is actually just another book kind of like R.C. Sproul's. So it's talking about biblical prophecy from a preterist perspective. Gosh, I feel really embarrassed. I wish I could remember the name of that book. But anyway, these would be 3 good resources if you want to explore the preterist interpretation. Now we're going to take a quick break and use the bathroom and then have some group discussion. I'm suspecting that we're not going to record this part, so I just want to quickly close in prayer and wish the viewers online a quick farewell, and then we'll go take our break and discuss. Heavenly Father, Lord, at various of us and to various degrees just really tremble with fear when we consider reading the book of Revelation. Fear because of the graphic things that it describes and our worry that we're going to see those unfold literally on the world stage. Or fear that we just aren't capable of making sense of what the book says, and so we just steer clear of it because we don't want to deal with those two kinds of fear. And yet, as we saw, the book tells us that we are blessed to read it, and if we keep it, even more blessed. And so I pray, Lord, that today, by giving the people here present as well as people that are watching online, by giving them a little bit of introduction to the book of Revelation and its author and its setting, and then by giving viewers and the people that are here 4 different schools of interpretation, some of which may resonate more with them than others, we're hoping that this gives people the tools necessary to encourage them to try giving the book another read. It is hard, but it doesn't have to be scary. And so I pray that you would encourage each of us as we leave here tonight, and those viewing online, and give us encouragement and confidence to be able to crack open the book of Revelation and start to make some sense of it. We're not going to make all the sense of the world of it all at once, but we might start to make sense of things. And when we do, we'll be blessed, as the author of Revelation says. So give us that confidence and that encouragement, and we just thank you for this theology night. Thank you so much for the people that put in the work to prepare these slides. Thank you for South Hill Baptist for hosting us. And I just pray you'd bring us back for the next theology night with even more fascinating topics and presentations. Thank you for Table of Hope. In Jesus' name, amen.